bellow ends of the scale in just war thinking. That means they have stood the test of time, they've endured for centuries. And here one thinks about the principle of non-combatant immunity, for example, or discrimination, as it is called. You know what this means. One is not permitted to make civilians the explicit target of military action. Or on the ad bellum side of the ledger, the insistence that the use of force should ideally be a response to an act of aggression by another party. This remains the guiding rule of thumb. But matters do not end here, and many aspects of just war thinking are, as you know, highly contested. What rises to the fore as exigent depends very much on the historic moment and its politics. For example, in the 1980s, the overriding concern was the possibility of a strategic nuclear exchange between the two great superpowers. It is unsurprisingly that just war discourse that had a public aim to get public discussion going, like the United States Catholic Bishops' Challenge of Peace, issued in 1983, had as its preeminent concern the nuclear question. Now, not I alone, but many in this room have pointed to the fact that times have changed quite remarkably, and that events, matters that were off to the side in the 1980s now loom as the heart of the matter. And I refer here to questions of humanitarian intervention and contending with non-state actors in the international arena who are, in practice, dedicated to terroristic ends using terroristic means. Now, how does one deal with such foes, those who lack international standing in a de jure sense? What is the right and wrong of it? When the Bush administration declared a global war on terror, it was widely derided in the media, both here and abroad, and this for a variety of reasons. One major concern was whether or not the term war can be deployed appropriately when a sovereign state battles a non-state entity or entities. Given that such entities may be sponsored by or given sanctuary by state actors like Al-Qaeda in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, can action be taken against the state or states as a means to defeat the purposes of the terrorists? Terms like preemption and prevention started to bubble to the surface of the discussion again as hot-button overriding preoccupations. So one issue that we need to look at ongoingly is to clarify the difference between the two and to ask if either is ever justifiable within the just war tradition. So another of the new things in international relations, as identified by George Weigel in a very interesting piece of a few years ago about new matters that just war thinkers have to contend with. Another, in addition to the question of legitimate public authority in the international realm, is the rise of non-state actors. Now, the terms preemption or prevention are sometimes used interchangeably. As you know, they are not synonyms, and one invites serious misunderstanding by failing to discriminate between the two. The barrier to the preventive use of force is higher than that for preemption, although both have to make a strong case. Now, some just war thinkers, as you know, rely on Westphalian presuppositions concerning the nigh absolute inviolability of state sovereignty as their starting point. But the just war tradition, as you also know, predates Westphalia by centuries, and within one strand of just war reasoning, state sovereignty has a distinctive relative, not a nigh absolute value. Although he by no means construes the state in absolute terms or as an absolute value, state sovereignty, as you know, occupies a given status or assumption in Professor Walzer's classic Just and Unjust Wars, published in 1977. And I'm sure that book and its ongoing history is one reason that we're all here today, given the liveliness of the discourse that has flowed from that classic work. Now, Waltz operates within the Walzer operates within the frame of what he calls the legalist paradigm. His presuppositions are Westphalian insofar as he takes the sovereign state as his basic unit of exploration and examination. Other just war thinkers, however, may begin in another place, so to speak, seeing in state sovereignty one value among many, but not necessarily the highest political value, and certainly not a secure trump card in argumentation. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because where one locates the state and the value one assigns to it helps to determine just how formidable will be the barriers to preemptive or preventive action. One can set that barrier so high that no course of preemption ever meets the standard of what is justifiable within the just war tradition. And prevention is ruled out of court so preemptorily that it isn't even worthy of sustained discussion. Others will lower the barrier at least somewhat, as state sovereignty is measured against other values that one endorses and cherishes, especially if those values incorporate an explicit anthropology or understanding of the human person. For example, a just war thinker who measures his or her position against the value of equal moral regard of persons, the dignity of the human person, may find that state sovereignty can and should be trumped on certain occasions in the name of a good that is being violated. The example that comes most readily to mind, of course, for us is genocide. Is one permitted to stand by and do nothing if one has the capacity to do something as a people or identifiable group is targeted for systematic slaughter? Do we resort to the inviolability of state sovereignty at such junctures? How do we override state sovereignty if we decide it is not the only or the highest good at stake in such a situation? Now, as I've already indicated, a few years ago, such questions were largely of academic interest as the Cold War dominated thinking about international affairs and the use of force. But with the breakup of the Soviet Union, questions that had lain relatively quiescent suddenly loomed. It seemed and seems as if we are bombarded daily. All we have to do is pay attention to the headlines of the last few months with cries of distress and calls for action of some sort to stop an atrocity here or an out-of-control state there. It behooves us, therefore, to be clear about the rough and ready meanings of preemption and prevention, respectively, keeping in mind throughout that there is no one settled stipulative definition of either of these concepts. In general, however, preemption refers to action taken in light of a threat of immediate provenance. The threat is here and now. If we do not act, claim responsible public officials, we will surely be overrun, attacked, even decimated tomorrow. Walzer discusses preemption in his book, as you know, and his example is the 1967 Six-Day War that began with Israel's attack on Egypt. Now, that example remains controversial. It's been much debated, but his reasoning is clear, and it helps us to take our bearings where preemption is concerned. Whatever one makes of Walzer's case study, he clarifies for us what preemption is all about, namely an immediate threat. The Israeli first strike was a case of legitimate anticipation, he argues, given an overwhelming intent to harm. Now, prevention is distinguished from preemption by the more distant nature of the threat. In the case of prevention, a state acts in such a way as to prevent the emergence of an immediate threat in the future, and does so given its assessment that the threat, when it develops fully, will be nearly impossible to contain or to defeat without significant cost in blood and treasure. Better then to nip this threat in the bud than to permit it to flower fully. Now, this way of thinking is clearly visible in current debates about Iran and its nuclear program. The debate demonstrates for us, I think, the fog of thinking about war, not just war itself, but thinking about war.